And Even in Arcadia, for me, is the autobiographical processing of the blessings and curses that come with fame, with notoriety, for someone who wants to remain in anonymity. Hi there guys, welcome back, and hello if you are new. So thanks ever so much for tuning in to another episode of mine. I feel really kind of rejuvenated after having gone away, went to Japan. It was absolutely fantastic, one of the most incredible countries I've ever been to. I also went to, drumroll, Tower Records. I might do a video actually later on of what I picked up there. Not a huge amount, but anyway. So that is kind of why I haven't really posted that much. I really wanted to just kind of take some time and really kind of sort of get back to grips with things. But of course, we're here to talk about a band which is, I'm sure, one of the most talked about bands maybe in music at the moment, I would say, considering their ascent has just been absolutely insane with this record. So without further ado, I'm going to be talking about Sleep Token and Even in Arcadia. I think the first listen to a record is incredibly important. You know, if you're not in the right headspace, you're not in the right environment, or maybe you're sort of listening to the album kind of fragmented, it really does leave an impact, I think, on that first listen. So with that in mind, I'd listened to the singles Emergence, Caramel and Damocles, rinsed them, absolutely rinsed them. But I hadn't listened to anything else. I wanted to wait until I got home, had my, like my record and all that sort of stuff, and kind of make a bit of a deal out of it. And the initial reaction was really kind of nothing I expected, because I was left so cold. I remember Take Me Back to Eden was an immediate love for me. And I thought, it basically moved me to tears as a record, which very few records ever have done that. And then, Even in Arcadia was very interesting. And I started to kind of question why. I'd come to realise that what I was actually wanting was more of that sound that we had in Take Me Back to Eden. But quite rightly so, Even in Arcadia is a totally different beast altogether. And I think to understand that, you really need to look at the album as a format. It's a snapshot in time from an artist. And this artist in particular, I think, has experienced unprecedented ascent to fame, success, all that sort of stuff, particularly in the fact that they are masked, they've never done an interview, anything like that. It's really quite unheard of. And Even in Arcadia, for me, is the autobiographical processing of the blessings and curses that come with fame, with notoriety, for someone who wants to remain in anonymity. So this record for me explores the ideas of isolation, and I kind of went through the tracks almost in a chronological order, I guess, because it did feel like that for me. Look to Windward felt like it was an overture of kind of looking inward. And then you've got Emergence, which I think is Vessel's first encounter with this idea that maybe it was even the birth of what became Sleep Token. The fact that the idea that this could be something, this artistry kind of came out of them. And I think even in the delivery of the chorus, it kind of sounds like, Vessel's coaxing something out a little bit, something that's shy and unsure of itself, trying to sort of nurture that a little bit. But then Past Self, the next track, is very much about the fundamental change of environment, of the inner circle, and the fact that really nothing will ever be the same again. And then following on from that, Dangerous, I think, examines the fact that, this idea of the danger of being in the limelight, but also the kind of allure of the limelight, and that, regardless of the danger, it still is quite attractive. And I think it's one of those things where maybe it's also exploring the obsessive nature of being a creative person, like where you can't, everything tells you that you shouldn't run towards it, but you kind of just instinctively do. That's just my interpretation of it. This is all just my interpretation of things. But I think one of the best songs on here is Caramel. You know, it's a track which is specifically aimed at the crazed fandom that Sleep Token has amassed. It's really the fans' insatiable curiosity and the fact that the anonymity has been stripped, and that's the one thing that, you know, Vessel Sleep Token wanted to keep, and it's kind of without his consent been sort of taken away. But equally, I think there's a similar kind of feeling on Damocles, which is the story of a nobleman which is kind of like positioned underneath this sort of hanging sword. Believe it or not, I knew about this because of Tomb Raider, and then I did some, you know, research and digging. But it's the track that I think examines the anxiety that comes with this meteoric rise to fame, and understanding, you know, will this still be here? Is this just a flash in the pan moment, and will I be forgotten? And can I keep going? Can I, you know, the amount of pressure that must have been feeling, you know, for like under this.
Everyone's trying the curtain is cold. How will I know if I can't see the bottom come up for
it? Really does kind of go into, did the fans actually have all the power? And then we kind of move into Gethsemane, which is I think it's the garden that Jesus prayed in before he was crucified. So again, it kind of has this imagery of this sort of almost like a Last Supper type thing, which I thought was interesting. And then Infinite Baths, I think, is kind of like his metaphorical crucifixion, maybe. You know, the fact that, or not crucifixion, but kind of the fact that he is here to endure what it is to be a performer. And I think it raises some really quite interesting topics about the idea of fame and fandom, and, you know, kind of things that people have been talking about, you know, like really kind of questioning of what do performers really owe their fans. Really, I think it's the understanding at the end of it all that this is who he is, and this is the price of fame. This is his new life. I think it's a record where Vessel is trying to sort of understand his real identity now that he's been thrust into this world of fame. It's kind of not losing yourself and understanding who the real person is under all this. And I watched, weirdly enough, on the way back from Japan, I watched Better Man, which is the new Robbie Williams film. And I think there's a similar kind of element here where it's kind of who is Robert and who is Robbie Williams. You know, Robbie Williams, the entertainer, but then you've also got Robert. And it's kind of understanding and separating those two things, which I'm sure a lot of people who have really experienced this level of fame have struggled with. And it must be a really big roller coaster of emotions to kind of embark on. And carrying on this idea of, you know, kind of examining the story of it, because I think that's a real big part of Sleep Token, for especially this record for me. I think it explores the idea of isolation. You know, you can see this flamingo bang in the middle in this beautiful sort of garden, but it also looks a little bit sad, a little bit forlorn. You know, he's positioned in the middle, I think, emphasizing that sort of space, you know, the isolation, the fact that he's isolated from his past life. People can't relate to him, you know, the sort of state of purgatory where he's in this sort of gilded cage that so many people would kill to be in, but also is awful to be in at the same time. And I think it's such an interesting way of looking at it. And ironically, when it comes to Sleep Token, I think this is a record that is incredibly vulnerable. It has not really that many metaphors. I mean, it does, but like, I think you kind of understand what is going on here and what Vessel is talking about, directly addressing the audience, especially in Caramel. Like, musically, you know, I thought initially this album was very simplistic, and again, like I said, it left me very cold. But I think after multiple listens, this is anything but. You know, the melodies are really well put together. They'll really worm their way into your ears, whether you want them to or not. And I've been sort of humming and singing all sorts of different melodies, but like, you know, I think this record is just one of those ones where it's taken time for it to really grow on me. And now I really, really, really do like it. Caramel and Damocles, for example, have some of my favorite vocal moments to date. The riffs are really interesting at the end of Infinite Baths, and I love that sort of little math rocky section of Gethsemane. And I think, you know, this record is very much exploring pop and, you know, Past Self, Dangerous. They're very sort of pop-oriented songs. And they are kind of quite timid melodies as well, which I thought was interesting.
One look at my past self, double taking my cash flow, apologizing for shit that frankly I stopped thinking of years ago. I could resist you, something in me just cannot.
But then there's also the classic feel of Sleep Token, I think. You know, you've got tracks like Provider and Emergence, which were kind of, you know, probably the most familiar ground to be trod. But there's a sort of interwoven melancholy that is always kind of at the center, I think, of Sleep Token, which is on Even In Arcadia and Look to Windward as well. So it's really, yeah, quite a roller coaster of emotions, this one, I think.
And your fingers will you hold this eclipse in?
And what I really liked, as, you know, often is the case, that the end of a Sleep Token record is kind of a big moment, and the fact that it was totally different from the last one, that it ends on this sort of like quite heavy riff, reminded me, you know, of like Meshuggah, Tesseract, that kind of thing, was nice because it was totally different from Euclid, which was and still is one of my favorite final tracks in a record. But I think the important thing is that you don't classify this record. I see so many people trying to be like, it's not this, it's this and whatever. Like, it's just an album. Like, you know, whatever this person is doing, just let them be. It doesn't have to be classified. It can be pop, it can be a bit metal, it can be like whatever. And I also think it's doing incredible things for the scene at large. Whether or not you like Sleep Token, you know, everyone knows about them now, I think. At the very least, you know, you've heard the name or something. And that's massive. You know, Ghost were at number 2 in the UK. It's proof that rock is very much at the forefront of, I think, you know, younger people maybe. Maybe it's because we're in trickier times and, you know, people want something to rebel against a little bit. But I think the key to understanding this record is understanding its message. This is the first time, really, I think, that Vessel's really kind of like spoken directly to the fans. And that takes balls, man. It's not easy, I don't think. And I know there's all these different rumors of the second albums and all this sort of stuff. I mean, the marketing behind it has been brilliant. But even if we don't get a second album, I would be more than happy with Even In Arcadia. I do think there might be a second record, though. I don't know. I just feel like there's been too much, you know, kind of yin and yang to have just the one record. But that'll be really, really interesting to find out. Even In Arcadia, for me, is an exploration of fame and the understanding of its rags and riches. And it's a record that uses wonderful imagery to kind of evoke the ideas of anxiety, isolation, even bewilderment, I think, in some of it, vulnerability and uncertainty. That, you know, often comes with the price of fame. It's a record of self-discovery and one that I have absolutely loved listening to. So I'd love to hear what you guys think. Obviously, I know it's been out for a little while now, but I just wanted to kind of put my thoughts out there on Sleep Token. So that's it from me. Thank you ever so much for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed this album review. If you did, it'd be great if you could hit that like and subscribe button. My next album review is going to be Rivers and Nihil, the self-titled record, and I've also got a wicked interview with Brody on the channel as well. Other than that, I'll see you guys very, very soon for another album review and more interviews, and we'll chat some more music. Take care, my friends, and I'll see you soon.